In the early 1930s, the first great mafia war shook America, a bloody conflict that left more than 120 men dead. It was a war that broke New York, shattered the nation, and gave birth to the modern mafia as we know it today. At the centre stood two powerful bosses, Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, bitter rivals who went to war for the crown of the boss of bosses. It drew in every heavyweight across the country. Everyone who was anyone was involved. Al Capone's men carried out hits in Chicago. Vito Genovese and Frank Costello fought in the streets of New York. Killings were ordered in Detroit, New Jersey, Pittsburgh, and beyond. Names that would one day become legends first proved themselves in this war, the Castellammarese War. But behind the scenes, a young gangster named Lucky Luciano was playing both sides, and he would emerge as the architect of a new American underworld, creating the modern American Mafia as we know it today. By the time that the blood had been washed from the streets, the Mafia would never be the same again. This is the full, untold story of the Castellammarese War, the great mafia war that changed America forever. Salvatore was born on the 31st of July 1886 in Castellammarese del Golfo, a small town on the island of Sicily. He was the 9th child born to Domenico Maranzano and Antonina Pisciota, who eventually would have 12 children. But this was the 1800s, when infant mortality rates were at an all-time high, and various other factors killed kids much younger than most like to think about. So Salvatore was actually the youngest of the 7 children that survived into adulthood. The Maranzanos were a God-fearing, hard-working Sicilian peasant family, with his father Domenico working as a farmhand, which earned him barely enough to put food on the table. Early on, Salvatore had aspirations to enter into the priesthood and even began his studies into the service, but the Mafia, then as it is now, was a strong presence in Sicily, and it drew him away from what would have been a very different path. Salvatore was attracted to what he saw: the clean pressed suits that they wore, the polished shoes, the gold jewellery, and the way his village hushed when they walked through the square. To a boy born into poverty, it was a far cry from what he knew, and he wanted a piece of it. It wasn't long before he fell into those circles, and like all of the new inductees, he ran errands, messages, and indulged in petty crimes. For the kids born into the Mafia, they already had status and usually wealth. But for the everyday Sicilian child who had very little in the form of job prospects, most of whom didn't even know if they'd eat tomorrow, and very little oversight from parents who were slaving away at manual labour jobs, well, it wasn't too hard to bring the kids in early. The gangs, creatively called baby gangs, drew in the younger children, and once they were appropriately enamoured by the money, danger and weapons, the bosses, or the dons as they were known, would send them off to collect the weekly extortion payments from small businesses, carry messages between upper heads, or to act as lookouts while other mafia members committed more serious crimes. Sending children around to deliver black market goods, weapons or extortion payments was already a common practice back in the 1800s, so the 8 and 9-year-olds were already doing some pretty dangerous work for the dons. Maranzano was a little different from the other aspiring mafiosos, where they were focused on proving their bravery, loyalty, and street smarts early on. Maranzano stayed in school and was focused on his studies. Besides his theology lessons, he also had an obsession with civilizations and leaders from the past. His main focus of study was with Julius Caesar and the Roman Empire, earning him the nickname Little Caesar early on. His intense studies on the Roman Empire deeply influenced his later dealings. He was tactical, to the point, and utterly unmoving in his convictions. Having run a few errands for them as a boy, by the time the Mafia fully got their claws into him, he was well into his teens. His later start didn't affect his rise in the ranks though. His obvious intelligence and his nearly encyclopedic knowledge of history and philosophy catapulted him up the ranks. He worked his way up to control the various rackets, extortion, and black market goods smuggling under the Don Vito Ferro, who controlled most of Sicily, before marrying Elisabetta Minore, sister of Salvatore Minore, an influential mafia boss in the city of Trapani and capo of the Minore mafia clan. The original Sicilian mafia operated by the same politics that the European royal houses did, so by marrying into another powerful family, Maranzano made a tactical move that gave him a great deal of connections in the right places. By the time he left Sicily in 1925, at the age of 39, he was a seasoned and established figure in the mafia. After World War I, with Sicily's economy in turmoil and America's Prohibition era opening vast bootlegging opportunities, Maranzano was sent by Don Vito Ferro to the United States to make a bid for control of mafia operations in New York City. Landing on Ellis Island and enduring the same medical examinations and shakedowns to receive his papers just like the other scrappy Italians that he'd been crammed alongside on that uncomfortable journey. There are no photos of Maranzano's youth, his family, or extended family. There are only 2 photographs of him alive. Well, when I say alive, one is this sketch made after his death, based on his autopsy examination, and the other is this rare candid shot. Maranzano, like the earlier Sicilian mafioso, believed in staying as anonymous as possible. The mobsters that came after him that was so heavily featured in the press was a serious point of contention for all of the old Mustache Petes, as they were known by the younger generation in this business. He set up shop in Manhattan, using a legit real estate business on Park Avenue as a front for his backdoor dealings. With the injection of mafia money from back home, the real estate business actually did very well, and in fact they did so well that the additional money from liquor trades being moved through the business didn't raise any red flags. Maranzano began gaining followers through Don Vito Ferro's connections and eventually seized control of most of Brooklyn. He didn't just take over bootlegging operations there, however, he extended to prostitution and narcotics distribution in just a few years. By 1929, he brought his wife, 3 sons and 1 daughter over to join him in the States, and in just 4 years Maranzano was the boss of his very own outfit, and the only people he answered to were his old accomplices and bosses back in Sicily. Let's just say that Maranzano had built a pretty significant empire in Manhattan, and he was already placing his eventual successors into the appropriate positions. Now for Giuseppe Joe Masseria, the other boss in New York, who rubbed Maranzano up in all the wrong ways. Giuseppe Masseria was born on January the 17th, 1886, in the Sicilian town of Menfi, in the province of Agrigento, into a modest family of tailors. His upbringing wasn't as harsh as Maranzano's. His family managed to bring in a steadier income, but unlike Maranzano, Masseria had little interest in schooling. He abandoned his studies early and, by the age of 8, was already running with the aforementioned baby gangs, delivering black market tobacco across Menfi for the Mafia, where his apprenticeship started. At the age of 16, in 1902, Masseria arrived at Ellis Island, but young Joey wasn't in the US because his parents wanted a better life for him. He'd fled to the US instead to escape a murder indictment. Masseria was deep in the Mafia before he'd even grown into his first pair of school shoes. Back then, he wasn't quite mature enough or powerful enough to pay and kill his way out of a conviction, so he took advantage of the US-Italian extradition treaty and started fresh in America. Well, kind of. He never planned on turning over a new leaf, he just fell in with the first, most powerful family that would have him and worked his way up from there. The Morello crime family, the city's premier Sicilian mafia outfit at the time, operated under the boss of all bosses, Giuseppe the Clutch Hand Morello, named so because of a deformed right hand with only one finger fused, and his right-hand man, Ignazio the Wolf Lupo, with the Morello gang controlling all of Little Italy and most of East Harlem. Masseria instantly liked the hard edge that the Americans had when it came to organised crime. Here, they were ruthless, they were out in the open, and they embraced the lead law. Whereas, back in Italy, things were rough, sure, but the dons over there preferred diplomacy over bullets. He quickly worked his way up as an enforcer, along with his loyal cadre of gunmen in Harlem and Little Italy. The Morello family built their reputation on blood and fear, most infamously through the barrel murders. Victims were hacked to pieces, stuffed into wooden barrels, and then discarded, sometimes dumped into the East River, other times left rotting in alleys or on street corners, and occasionally even shipped to fictitious addresses in distant cities. Morello was quoted as saying, "Leave them in a barrel and the rest will fall in line." Their business empire ran on extortion, loan sharking, the Italian lottery, counterfeiting, and robbery. What set them apart, however, was their ability to launder illicit profits through legitimate storefronts and restaurants, making them the first organised outfit in New York to systematise this kind of financial camouflage. They also refined extortion into something more sustainable, demanding smaller weekly protection payments rather than one-off heists that could ruin a business. Borrowed from the Black Hand but perfected under Morello, this method guaranteed steady income and long-term control. By 1905, with the help of his new, ruthless young enforcer, Masseria, Giuseppe Morello had assembled the largest and most influential Sicilian crime family in New York, and he himself was recognised as Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of all bosses, by mafia leaders across the United States. His underboss, the Wolf, was suspected in some 60 killings, while Morello himself was tied to more than 100. In this violent second apprenticeship, Masseria thrived, quickly finding that he enjoyed the bloodletting just as much as the profits, and of the two bosses, Masseria was by far the more trigger-happy of the two factions that would 20 years later enter into the bloodiest war that New York City had ever seen. Masseria eventually received a suspended sentence for burglary in 1909 and was later sentenced in 1913 to 6 years for third-degree burglary, cementing his street-level reputation as a ruthless enforcer. Whilst Masseria was inside, Morello himself was sentenced to 25 years in prison, and upon Masseria's release, it wasn't long before he and fellow Morello lieutenants Gaetano Tommy Reina and Salvatore Toto d'Aquila split from the Morello empire to each form their own individual outfits as the 1920s began to roar. Both Reina and d'Aquila immigrated to the US from Sicily, Reina as a child from the Corleone district and d'Aquila from Palermo, so it shouldn't come as a surprise that they were very traditional in their beliefs, d'Aquila especially so, given that he'd spent all his formative years in Sicily learning the trade from the original factions. He was much older, nearing 40, so his departure was expected and encouraged. D'Aquila took most of East Harlem and Reina took the Bronx with ease. The split was amicable as mob splits could be at least, and the three of them remained on reasonably good terms for a few years after their exit from the Morello family. Toto d'Aquila was so successful at this time that he was appointed Capo dei Capi, or the boss of all bosses, and with his crime family controlling much of East Harlem and what was left of the Bronx where Tommy Reina's territory didn't stretch, his own crew could now rival the old Morello crew in its heyday. There was also another family of prominence that formed right as this trio split, the Profaci family, headed by Joe Profaci. Profaci held on to most of Brooklyn, so much so that the outfit was sometimes referred to as the Brooklyn family, and they had some influence in Queens and Long Island as well. In 1925, 28-year-old Joe Profaci found a mentor in 39-year-old Salvatore Maranzano, who proved himself more knowledgeable than Profaci, and the Brooklyn business began to boom. Eventually, Maranzano absorbed Profaci's crew into his Castellammarese faction, with Profaci serving as a captain, giving Maranzano command of a 150-man crew that had carved out a substantial share of Prohibition-era New York. Meanwhile, in the same year, the clutch hand walked free from jail and was welcomed back with open arms by Masseria, who now brought his old boss into the fold as his official advisor. Seeing this as a dangerous threat, Toto d'Aquila moved to eliminate both his former boss and Masseria, igniting a bloody conflict that left 30 men dead, though even that was little more than a speck of dirt compared to what was still to come. Both Masseria and d'Aquila wanted ultimate power over New York, and neither were willing to share turf. History or not, this was a power struggle to be the boss of all bosses. The stakes for both men were the throne or death. By the early 1920s, open war had broken out between the two factions. Toto d'Aquila's chief enforcer was the feared gunman Umberto the Ghost Valenti, a nickname earned for his uncanny ability to vanish without a trace after every mob hit. Toto ordered him to eliminate Joe Masseria and Morello. On May 8, 1922, the conflict claimed its first major victim when Vincenzo Terranova, boss of the Terranova crime family and a Masseria ally, was gunned down in a drive-by outside his home on East 116th Street. Valenti himself personally pulling the trigger. Just hours later, Valenti struck again when Terranova's underboss, Silva Tagliagamba, was shot and killed in Lower Manhattan. That same night, Valenti's bloodlust was remarkably still not quenched, leading him to ambush Masseria and his bodyguards on Grand Street, brazenly just a block away from police headquarters. Masseria managed to escape with his life, though the attackers left 4 men and 2 women bleeding in the street. In the chaos, Masseria tossed away his pistol and was arrested while fleeing the scene. 3 months later, on August the 9th, Valenti tried once more. As Masseria stepped out of his apartment at 80 2nd Avenue, he was rushed by 2 gunmen who opened fire. Masseria ducked into a nearby store as bullets tore through the glass and the woodwork. The shooters kept firing before dashing across the street to a waiting getaway car, which sped off down East 5th Street, spraying bullets into a crowd as it went and leaving 6 bystanders wounded. When the smoke cleared, police found Masseria upstairs in his bedroom, dazed but alive. He had escaped the ambush with only 2 perfectly circular holes in the straw hat on his head, but not 1 bullet inside his body. The same cannot be said for the 6 civilians caught in the crossfire. 2 died and 4 were badly injured. From that day forward, Masseria was spoken of with awe as the man who could dodge bullets, a reputation that transformed him into one of the most feared and respected figures in New York's underworld. After this close shave, Masseria waited just 48 hours to take Valenti out. On August the 11th, Valenti attended a sit-down with Masseria and Morello in a cafe at the corner of 2nd Avenue and East 12th Street. The meeting was ultimately an ambush, and realizing his life was in danger, the ghost burst from the table and ran outside as the bullets began firing. An 8-year-old girl standing nearby was wounded, but Valenti himself managed to make it onto the running board of a taxi before collapsing on the pavement, where he died, aged 30. Although the deaths of Vincenzo Terranova and his underboss allowed D'Aquila to absorb the rest of East Harlem that he didn't control, his grip on his people was faltering. He now quite literally had barely any upper figures, willing to pick up arms against the enemy that seemingly couldn't die. D'Aquila lost the war long before Masseria's hit on him finally took out the old boss for good. On October the 10th, 1928, as D'Aquila exited his vehicle on the way to a doctor's appointment on Avenue A in Manhattan, 2 gunmen opened fire and the Capo dei Capi was struck 9 times. D'Aquila was dead before he hit the ground. He was dragged into a nearby drugstore by bystanders trying to save his life, where these pictures were taken, but it was soon clear that there was no saving him, and Joe Masseria took the throne of Capo dei Capi, and from that day forward he was known unanimously across New York as Joe the Boss. Masseria moved fast to fill the power vacuum in East Harlem and Manhattan's Little Italy. He installed Manfredi Mineo, D'Aquila's underboss and a Masseria ally from the Morello gang days, as the new boss of D'Aquila's family. Mineo is probably the man who gave Masseria the info of his former boss's routine, and for that, Mineo took control of the loan sharking, extortion and gambling rackets, channeling the proceeds into Masseria's bankroll. He secured protection contracts to businesses that previously belonged to D'Aquila. The transition was so smooth that any remaining rival factions didn't even consider continuing the war because their business hardly changed at all. This minor war that happened right before the Castellammarese War is an important factor because it set the stage for the colossal civil war that was about to follow. Taking a man's life for power was of no consequence. The streets were a battlefield. It was one of the first instances of a mafia civil war happening at a time when New York was shrouded in bootleg booze during Prohibition, when alcohol was illegal. And most in New York at the time thought that the violence was a result of a turf war due to the lucrative opportunity that Prohibition was. On one hand, New York was the epicenter of Broadway, vaudeville acts and elites in the performing arts. Oh, they had their speakeasies and illegal drinking parties in this Prohibition era, and the mob supplied them all. But this wasn't like what Hollywood would later become, where mobsters and the stars openly mingled with each other. The performers and the politicians in the 20s sat in their luxury apartments overlooking the city from the skyline, while a bloody, murderous conflict was raging unseen underneath them. The police had their hands full. Besides the Italians killing each other in broad daylight, dozens of innocent people were getting caught in the crossfire. The Jews were setting up transportation lines for the off-brand whiskey that the Italians and the Irish were brewing in hidden away storage units and underground tunnels. Brothels, gambling houses and drug dens were popping up all over the place. The Italians and their wars were going on unchecked, simply because in the mayhem that was the Roaring 20s, there was too much going on for police to focus on gangsters killing each other. And, to top it all off, the sudden influx of immigrants changed the way the mob functioned. The old Sicilian factions worked by European laws, by marrying their daughters off to unite families, keeping the Italian line pure and untainted. Their meetings bordered on cultishness, with all their intricate steps and highborn etiquette. But these first and second generation American gangs and mobsters didn't care for those outdated traditions. They grew up on US soil, quite literally sitting next to Jewish and Irish kids in school. The young uns had their own name for the staunchly traditional older generation too. They called them the Mustache Petes, making the point that all of the ancient dons had these magnificent, out-of-fashion, manicured mustaches, and they believed that their mustaches were as outdated as their beliefs. To the dons back in Europe's disgust, their Italian teenagers in the US were running around with the Irish, who they thought were nothing more than savages. Even worse, the Jews weren't just operating alongside their boys, they were, in many ways, doing an even better job of their illegal enterprises. These were the kids that were swallowed by the old-timers, Maranzano and Masseria, the kids who blurred the lines between race, culture and tradition. To them, if the money was hot and a business opportunity arose, then your background didn't matter. It was all business to them. The new generation did not rely on bloodlines, backgrounds or marriages to seal contracts. Bosses weren't regarded with royal fascination anymore. Your reputation and the respect that you had was entirely reliant on what you'd proven on the streets. They were all about business, and in order to operate almost entirely on profits, well, that's when the language starts to change, quite literally. And one of those speaking that language was a Sicilian-born peasant named Salvatore Lucania, or, as he was more commonly known, Charles Lucky Luciano. Charlie Luciano, like Maranzano and Masseria, was born in Sicily in 1897, making him 11 years their junior. He had come to the US with his family in 1906, and he had fought, stolen and hustled his way through the Italian slums in the Lower East Side. By 1928, he had become the boss of his own crime family. Luciano was part of a new generation of mobsters who rejected the rigid traditions of the so-called Mustache Petes. His closest allies were men whom Maranzano and Masseria would never have admitted into their strictly Sicilian ranks. Mainland Italians such as Joe Masseria and Frank Costello, Jewish associates like the financial mastermind Meyer Lansky and the volatile gunman Bugsy Siegel, and even the German Jewish powerhouse Dutch Schultz, by then known as the beer baron of the Bronx. In the Bronx itself, every other racket was under the control of Tommy Reina. This crew, that would become known as the New Guard, had come to dominate New York's liquor trade at a time when the Mustache Petes still clung to more traditional rackets like olive oil imports and gambling. Lucky's rapid rise had caught the eye of both Maranzano and Masseria, and it was clear that sooner or later, if he wanted to exist in their city, he'd have to pick a side. Lucky had been approached by Maranzano first, after the old man, as Lucky called him, watched him carve his way out in the underworld. Lucky rubbed shoulders with some extremely powerful men and had gotten himself out of more than one sticky situation using his brains rather than his fists. Maranzano made the mistake of offering to take Lucky in and away from the Jewish and Irish scum that he'd come to befriend. No matter how powerful they were, in Maranzano's eyes, a good Sicilian boy should not be seen with such lowly blood. This rubbed Lucky the wrong way, and he instantly distrusted the old boss. Maranzano tried for a second time, this time at a Jack Dempsey fight where there were more eyes to pressure Lucky's decision, but once again he declined, politely but firmly, so Masseria called on Lucky instead, inviting him to join his forces. The truth was that both bosses wanted Lucky in their ranks because they wanted to avoid him going off and rivaling them for power, which was, by this point, inevitable. Lucky had long since outgrown the streets, he owned beer trucks, had his own shipment routes laid down, and more than enough contacts in the bootlegging business, not to mention a deep hand in speakeasies and gambling rackets himself. But one thing the Sicilians didn't like is that Lucky came with the Irish and Jewish mobsters in tow. To have a potential boss that so openly did business with the outsiders could be catastrophic to the Sicilian way of life. Joe the Boss did not succeed in getting Lucky to come to his faction willingly. He tried to sway him over drinks at Lucky's Speakeasy, the 21st Club at 21 West 52nd Street in Manhattan, nearly succeeding, but the next day he acted like a dictator, summoning Lucky to a meeting at his suite at the Pennsylvania Hotel, acting as though Lucky was his underling. When Lucky declined the offer, Masseria took to the offensive. He targeted Lucky's beer trucks, and the trucks and their contents disappeared en route. The message was clear: join the Masseria family, or Masseria would put Lucky on his growing list of men awaiting their execution. Lucky was forced to pick a side purely for survival, but that didn't mean he had to like the man who commanded him. He picked Masseria as Joe the Boss was more lenient with Lucky's non-Sicilian associates, whereas for Maranzano, this was a no-go. Masseria had bullied Lucky into a temporary submission, something Lucky wouldn't forget. But at least, for now, Masseria had the guns and the men capable of delivering him pure power in New York. Although Joe the Boss was capo dei capi and had a crew of 200 men, Maranzano was a major threat, having around 150 of his own, and Masseria knew that he needed more allies to wipe out Maranzano, which was his ultimate goal, with Maranzano's ultimate goal being to clinch that crown of capo dei capi. And in securing his own ultimate goal, to Lucky, Masseria had become intolerable, calling Luciano at all hours, demanding his presence at warehouses, wanting him present in deals that didn't require it. Whenever a truck went missing or a speakeasy was raided, suspicion landed on Lucky. For a man who envisioned an empire run with efficiency, Masseria's bluster and paranoia were unbearable. Maranzano, meanwhile, watched from afar. He knew that Masseria was grating on Lucky, and also knew that soon the Young Guns would be part of his army. Lucky was caught in the middle. If he stayed with Masseria, suspicion and jealousy would lead to Joe the Boss eventually killing him. If he joined Maranzano, he would be shackled to a man who despised half of his closest allies. Lucky was between a rock and a hard place. The tension boiled over one evening when Masseria stormed into their headquarters suite at the Pennsylvania Hotel, raging with paranoia that Charlie was stealing his whiskey business. Luciano, calm by the window with a cigarette in hand, let him rage. He knew the outburst was more than anger, it was a warning. Afterwards, he gathered his closest men. He knew that eventually Masseria would wipe him out and his crew. They needed protection, and that meant they needed Maranzano. Through Tommy Lucchese, a Luciano ally and a Maranzano understudy, Luciano arranged a meeting on neutral ground, a warehouse on Staten Island. At first, Maranzano played the statesman, repeating promises of protection and profit. Then came the demand. Luciano had to kill Masseria himself, not arrange it, not send others, but do it with his own hands. In Sicilian code, the man who killed the capo dei capi could never inherit his throne. Lucky knew that, and Maranzano knew it as well. The condition was a trap, and eventually Maranzano would kill Lucky. "You're crazy," Lucky snapped. The beating began instantly. A pistol butt crashed into his skull, which knocked him unconscious, and when he awoke, he was hanging by his thumbs on meat hooks. His body was sagging, his flesh seared with cigarette burns. Belts and clubs rained down on him. Maranzano himself stepped forward, urging him to agree. He said, "Kill him and you'll live. Refuse and you'll die here tonight." But Luciano clenched his jaw, and at one point he even kicked Maranzano to the floor, sending him into a fury. Maranzano slashed a knife across his face, carving a wound that would scar him for life and leave him with his characteristic drooping eye. Another slash tore through his chest, his eyes filled with blood, but still he refused. Suddenly, one of the men cocked a pistol and put it to Lucky's head. "No, don't," snapped Maranzano. He will do what needs to be done, won't you, Bambino? As Maranzano weirdly referred to Luciano as. An inch from death, they dragged him outside, threw him into a car, and dumped him outside the Terra Marine Inn on Staten Island's Highland Boulevard. At 3 in the morning, a police cruiser found him in the road. Doctors at the hospital stitched his face and chest, 55 stitches in all, and as he lay recovering in hospital, Meyer Lansky visited. Charlie whispered, "I guess I'm just lucky to be alive," and Meyer Lansky smirked. "Yeah, that's you, Lucky Luciano." The nickname, already in use, stuck for good. But the scars carried a deeper lesson. Neither Masseria nor Maranzano could be trusted. Both were relics, clinging to old codes while the world moved on. Lucky understood that his survival would not come from choosing one side, but from reshaping the entire order. He would play their war, bide his time, and, when the moment came, sweep them both aside. This was 1929, and this time the war that was about to take place could no longer be ignored by the papers and the elites. It was going to change the mafia, the gangs, the law enforcement, and have an impact so great that it paved the road for the mob for the next century, and it started with Joe the Boss's first big mistake. With D'Aquila dead, he took on the third member of the original trio that left the Morello family, Gaetano Reina. After the hit on one of his closest allies, Salvatore D'Aquila, Reina felt it safer to secretly switch his loyalties over to Maranzano because he wanted to get some distance between him and his old friend Joe the Boss, who apparently didn't care much for loyalty towards old family members. Reina's abandonment was a betrayal that Masseria couldn't tolerate. He ordered his new second-in-command, Lucky Luciano, to organise the ambush. On the evening of the 26th of February 1930, Reina left his aunt's apartment at 1522 Sheridan Avenue in the Bronx. He noticed Vito Genovese across the street and began waving. Vito Genovese was one of the few members of Lucky's crew that was accepted by Masseria, as Genovese was Sicilian. He was also a bloodthirsty, remorseless psychopath, and he walked right up to Tommy Reina, someone he'd known for years, and shot him point blank in the face with a shotgun. As the rules of a Sicilian war commanded, the executions had to be done face to face. The killing of Tommy Reina shocked the underworld. He was one of the most respected men in the city, cultured, honourable, and in control of the ice racket, which in an era before refrigerators meant power over 3/4 of the city's household, something that the greedy Masseria fancied for himself. Joe the Boss took over Reina's rackets and installed his own man, Joseph Pinzolo, as boss, instead of Reina's old lieutenants Tommy Lucchese and Tommy Gagliano, two allies of Lucky, which rubbed them up the wrong way. And with Tommy Reina's death, the first official blood had been spilt. Masseria's next move made everything perfectly clear. This was going to spill over well beyond New York, and everybody needed to choose a side and make their stand. In Chicago, the underworld landscape was much more fragmented. They had outfits rather than mafia families, but they did have the Unione Siciliana, which was an Italian-American fraternal organisation that started as a way to support Sicilian immigrants, but had quickly evolved into a criminal organisation itself and a kind of governing body of the Italian gangs in Chicago. And at the beginning of 1930, it was looking for a new leader. The two main candidates for this position was Joey Aiello, a Maranzano ally and the head of his own powerful gang, and Al Capone, a man who needs no introduction. Capone was undoubtedly the most powerful and the most notorious crime boss in the country. His crew boasted around 500 to 600 members at its peak, which dwarfed Maranzano and Masseria's outfits combined, and Joe the Boss thought that that was the kind of ally he needed to wipe out Maranzano for good. Capone wasn't Sicilian though, he was Neapolitan, hailing from the small village of Angri near Naples, and therefore couldn't be made head of the Unione Siciliana. Joe the Boss knew that if Capone was made head of the Unione, he'd have more new allies in his fight against Maranzano. So, for the first time in his life, Joe the Boss followed Luciano's example and rallied for a non-Sicilian to gain power. His first stop was Gaspar Milazzo, a fellow Sicilian, staunch traditionalist, and highly respected with almost every faction in the country. Milazzo was the type of guy you brought in to mediate debates, disputes, and new deals. He was fair, unmoving in his convictions, and his decision was final. Around Milazzo's table there was rarely any violence. He was an upper head in the East Side mob of Detroit. Detroit at this time was split into three main factions. The East Side mob, led by Salvatore Castellammarese, and the West Side mob, led by Castellammarese, were both Sicilian Mafia outfits, but unlike Masseria and Maranzano, at this point they actually got along. The third main outfit was the Purple Gang, a Jewish faction who dominated the rum running in Detroit, similar to Lucky and his crew. At this moment in time, Milazzo was finally set to become the next official boss after Salvatore Castellammarese died of pneumonia. Since the previous boss had just died, there was an expected period of mourning necessary before making his new position official. But by all intents and purposes, Milazzo was already the boss. Eventually, the East Side and West Side mobs would merge, which would later become known as the Detroit Partnership, but that shuffling of power is a tale for another day. Let's just say that the Detroit faction had their roots deep in every corner of the country, and Milazzo was at the very top of that. Masseria had the right idea approaching Milazzo. Milazzo was the consigliere in Detroit, which was a peacekeeping role where he acted as a mediator between all the factions in Detroit. But he refused to give his support to Masseria and insisted that Capone could not be the head of the Unione. And, as we know, Masseria didn't take well to being rebuffed, nor had he had to deal with an embarrassment of this kind before. Milazzo, the ally of all in the underworld, had looked down on Masseria, and that had hurt his pride and his standing amongst the other factions. So he hatched a plan that would restore both his pride and his standing. Masseria convinced his ally and West Side mob leader, Castellammarese, to arrange a meeting under the pretense that Joe the Boss and Milazzo would have a sit-down to discuss peace before the growing tensions overflowed into something worse. Milazzo agreed despite his distrust of Masseria and the way he'd wiped out D'Aquila and Tommy Reina, former close allies of Joe the Boss, but surely no one would dare to touch Milazzo. Besides having many friends in high places, it was an unspoken rule that consiglieres, mediators, and messengers were not to be touched. To harm them during negotiations was to commit a cardinal sin. Milazzo and his right-hand man, Sam Perino, arrived at the Verner Highway Fish Market in Detroit just after 1 p.m. on May the 31st, 1930. They sat down, started eating their lunch, waiting for Lamare, Masseria, and his associates to arrive. Two gunmen were already seated at nearby tables. When their plates arrived, the gunmen leaped out of hiding and opened fire with gunshots. Milazzo was shot in the head, killing him instantly, while Perino was shot 3 times in the abdomen, chest, and arm. 2 bystanders were also injured in the hail of bullets. Perino hung on for a couple of minutes but died in the fish market. Milazzo's assassination was done entirely out of hurt pride and an overestimation of just how much weight Masseria had the right to throw around. The power had gone to his head, and he was of the impression that his call, his beliefs, and his word was above Mafia law. The traditionalists were fuming, and everyone else that was more liberal with their ideals were horrified that Masseria had dared kill a hero in the Mafia.
Masseria knew that this last hit had angered, well, everybody, and if he was going to live to see the next day, he couldn't allow them to absorb the true implications of Milazzo's death and the complete disregard for tradition that Masseria had thrown into the wind. So he needed to do two things: strike again before they had time to formulate a plan, and take out the players that posed the most danger to him and the empire he was building on the blood of others. This was the moment that both factions truly prepared for war. In New York, Maranzano stockpiled Tommy guns, revolvers and bombs, building an arsenal to outfit his growing army. Masseria matched him weapon for weapon.
Maranzano called on his allies and boasted a star-studded squad of ruthless mobsters who mainly hailed from Castellammarese del Golfo, like himself. There was Joseph Bonanno, a ruthless killer who idolised Maranzano. Vito Bonaventre, the head of a hit squad called the Good Killers due to their efficiency. Stefano the Undertaker Margadino, the head of the Buffalo crime family, and a man whose nickname speaks for itself. Joe Profaci, his longtime captain and a force in his own right, the aforementioned Joey Aiello, who was as bold as brass and had the guts to have been at war with none other than Al Capone himself for the last 3 years, and both the Tommies, Gagliano and Lucchese, who had turned on Masseria after he ordered the death of their boss Tommy Reina and installed his own man, Joseph Pinzolo, as their boss. Now that is a frightening, trigger-happy lineup, but Masseria had an army that was capable of rivaling it. His right-hand man was Giuseppe the Clutch-Hand Morello, a man who had ruled New York 20 years prior and was fond of a murder or two himself. Masseria had also secured the loyalty of Al Capone and his mammoth Chicago outfit after supporting him for the head of the Unione, though Capone himself had no interest in meddling with New York wars. He had far too many going on in Chicago. Manfredi Mineo, a ruthless killer who Masseria installed as boss after the death of D'Aquila, and then he had the brightest young spark in the underworld, Charles Lucky Luciano. Despite being only 31 at this point, Luciano had perhaps the most savage and trigger-happy crew of gunmen under his control, including Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese, Willie Moretti, Joe Adonis, Frank Costello, and Carlo Gambino, not to mention around 50 Jewish hitmen he could call on if necessary, though both factions preferred to keep the war strictly Sicilian, or at least Italian. Masseria had sheer power, but not much brains, and Maranzano, with his study of the Roman Empire, knew exactly how a war was won without relying solely on violence. Masseria had no idea that Lucky was working with Maranzano behind his back, and that his main aim was to play both Moustache Pete's against each other, letting them decimate their own ranks before taking over himself. Maranzano also had no idea, but he employed taxi drivers to keep tabs on Masseria and all of his most prominent figures. This was money well spent. Those cabbies had pins on everyone involved in this war. Between their information and Masseria's habit of flaunting his position out in the open, the Castellammarese faction could always stay one step ahead.
65 years earlier, in 1865, the guns of the American Civil War had fallen silent, but now, in 1930, another war was about to erupt on American soil, one fought with Tommy guns and ambushes in the streets. This was to be the Mafia's own civil war, and the Castellammarese War had begun.
Masseria struck first. On July the 15th, 1930, Vito Bonaventre had just parked his car outside his home at 69 Orient Avenue in Brooklyn and walked out of his garage shown in this photo. Suddenly, Tommy guns exploded and Vito was hit 13 times, dying where he fell, aged 55. This one hurt Maranzano deeply, and he responded with vengeance. Masseria's most important ally was his advisor, Giuseppe the Clutch Hand Morello, in reference to his deformed right hand that only had one fused finger. Morello was a living relic of the old Black Hand era, one of the earliest bosses in America, and a man who had once commanded fear across Little Italy. Now he was Masseria's consigliere and shadow, an advisor who never left his side. On August the 15th, 1930, Morello sat in his loan sharking office at 352 East 116th Street in East Harlem, his crippled hands scrawling numbers in ledgers when the trap closed. The shooters came from both factions. One was Maranzano's secret weapon, a man named Sebastiano Domingo, or as he was known, Buster from Chicago, and the other was Albert Anastasia, loyal through and through to Lucky Luciano. The ambush was fast, precise, and deadly. Morello was cut down in his chair with his right-hand man, Joseph Periano, his blood soaking the pages of accounts that would never be balanced. Sebastiano Domingo, or as he was more commonly known, Buster from Chicago, is a man all too typically of whom only this poor photo survives of, but he was lethal. Buster from Chicago was an ally of Joey Aiello, and he was known back in the Windy City not only for hiding his Tommy gun in a guitar or a violin case, but for being absolutely lethal. In the war that was unfolding, he was estimated to have killed between 20 and 30 members of Masseria's faction. After this hit, Joseph Pinzolo, or Fat Joe as he was known on the streets, came into play again. Pinzolo had been placed as the head of Tommy Reina's huge ice racket. The scam wasn't selling ice to regular customers and shops, though they did plenty of that too. The real money lay with the protection rackets that they set up from the shop owners who were forced to buy ice from them, and for the cover of other products that they could smuggle in those ice trucks. If it weren't for his reputation as a rat, Fat Joe would have fit in this sector perfectly. You see, Fat Joe Pinzolo was not a trusted man, so this appointment didn't go down well. His past was rife with double crosses.
He made his mark in 1908 when he bombed a business owner's establishment to force the man to pay his boss at the time, Giuseppe Constabile, who ran an extortion racket. He got caught and he spilt the beans on his boss Constabile during questioning. Normally this would have been an automatic death sentence for Fat Joe. Snitching is unacceptable in the mob, but he retracted his statement, refusing to testify on the stand, taking the 2.5-year sentence instead. That allowed him to walk away with his heart still beating, but no one in the underworld trusted him anymore. Masseria took him in as one of his gunmen, allowing him the only chance he'd ever get to redeem himself, even if the rest of the mafia would never accept him fully.
But everyone knew that Fat Joe had no business being any kind of boss. Pinzolo was a fool. He mistook Masseria's authority for his own and began barking orders at Reina's old lieutenants, Tommy Lucchese and Tommy Gagliano, as if he were Joe the boss himself. The two Tommies, insulted and disgusted, conspired with Maranzano and Lucky Luciano, as both Tommies were childhood friends of Lucky, and soon Pinzolo was lured to the Brokaw building at 1487 Broadway under the pretense of business. When he entered the adjoining room, the door closed behind him and the shots rang out. He was left slumped and bleeding, his arrogance silenced forever, and Fat Joe's undeserved reign of his own faction lasted just a few months. The two Tommies turned on Masseria, joining the old Sicilians and taking the remainder of Reina's faction with them. There was a few skeletons in Joe the Boss's closet who were currently allied to him that he'd annoyed in his pursuit of power, and the Castellammarese faction knew this. They wanted Masseria to dig his own grave by putting others in theirs and alienating himself from his allies until he was virtually alone. That was the hope, at least. Back in Chicago, Joey Aiello and Al Capone were still butting heads over who could control the Unione Siciliana and thus control the city. But their turf war finally came to a head in typical Capone fashion on October the 30th, 1930, when Aiello was gunned down in front of an apartment building at 2553 West Lunt Avenue in the Rogers Park neighborhood of Chicago. He was peppered with 59 rounds coming in from all sides. Joey Aiello had been donating $5,000 to Maranzano's war chest weekly, the equivalent of around $100,000 today. This stream of income was a devastating loss for the Castellammarese forces. Capone had also orchestrated this hit without consulting Lucky Luciano, who was secretly on Maranzano's side. Capone wanted Aiello dead so he could rule the Unione, and ultimately Capone did what he wanted. But in gratitude, Capone secretly sent some of his men over to New York so that they could add some muscle to the Castellammarese forces. The loss of Aiello was even more devastating for Maranzano because Aiello was a man of considerable political influence. Al Capone had his hands too full with his own wars and, truth be told, had no interest in politics apart from greasing the palms of the mayor. Thus, the entire Castellammarese side had no more political swing, and that's a big problem when all of your business involves illegalities. Maranzano, despite the loss of Aiello, didn't let up. On November the 5th, 1930, Manfredi Mineo and Stefano Ferrigno, lieutenants of Masseria and among his most trusted captains, were targeted. The hitmen had rented an apartment overlooking the courtyard at 750 Pelham Parkway in the Bronx. Their true target had been Masseria himself, but when Mineo and Ferrigno stepped into the garden below, opportunity was seized. Gunfire erupted from the first floor window and both men collapsed into the cold dirt, riddled with bullets, their bodies sprawled like broken marionettes in the courtyard of an otherwise quiet residential block. Once more, the killers was Maranzano's man, Buster from Chicago, aided this time by another of his deadly assassins, Girolamo Santuccio.
Reyna was gone, Pinzolo was gone, Aiello was gone, Bonventre was gone, Morello was gone, Mineo and Ferrigno were gone. The bodies that did not make the papers were quietly buried in Potter's Field or dumped in the East River. The war spread like fire in a field of grass. Every week brought new ambushes, new killings, and new funerals. Detectives shook their heads, overwhelmed by the amount of bloodletting. The police blotters filled with names of men whose faces would never be seen again. The papers reported it as a Sicilian war, but also going on in the city at the time was a huge war between Dutch Schultz and his nemesis, Mad Dog Coll. So the police had a ridiculously hard time linking the right bodies to the right war. By early 1931, the city was drowning in whispers, every saloon and speakeasy buzzing with the tally of the dead. Bodies dropped daily, and in the middle of it all stood one man, Lucky Luciano, scathed but unbroken, playing his game with patience, watching as the Mustache Petes cut each other down whilst he prepared his own endgame.
Maranzano made no secret that he was taking over all of Mineo's bootlegging, gambling and extortion rackets. And again, the element of surprise and the sheer stones on this man caught everyone off guard. The soldiers and the business partners who didn't flee to sympathetic factions for their safety were killed before they could offer resistance. In early 1931, Maranzano made another move. He ordered a hit on Joseph Catania, one of Masseria's highest-ranking lieutenants. Catania and his band of underlings had been tasked for the last 6 months to hijack Maranzano's liquor trucks. By Lucky's tactical organisation and information, this ended up a great success, killing a few of the guards and drivers along the way as they did so, and reducing Maranzano's ranks. On February the 3rd, 1931, in front of a candy store located at 2373 Belmont Avenue, Catania was approached by a Maranzano soldier, Joseph Velacci, who shot him 6 times. Catania was found slumped over on the sidewalk, remarkably still breathing. However, he died 2 days later in the hospital without ever regaining consciousness. Masseria was furious. Catania's shtick was working well, gaining an enormous amount for Masseria's booze shipments to extend even wider, but Masseria wasn't getting much sympathy from anyone else for the hit. Joe the boss, oblivious to the fact that Luciano was working with Maranzano, remained as demanding as ever. He phoned Lucky at all hours, still berating him for sleeping late, demanding his presence at whiskey shipments, insisting he be involved in every detail of the business. He was loud, suspicious, overbearing, and increasingly paranoid. Worse still, he refused to modernize. He had no vision for alliances, no trust in the Jews or the Irish or anyone who wasn't Sicilian. The gap between Lucky and Masseria widened daily. Luciano saw the writing on the wall. He called his gang together at their headquarters, a suite at the Hotel Claridge's, and he told them, "If I stay with Joe the boss, he'll kill me sooner or later. If I go to Maranzano, he'll use me and then kill me. So we will kill them both. But we start with Joe. We can't build anything until he's gone." The others nodded, each man understanding that the time had finally come. Lucky moved carefully, securing guarantees. He reached out to Maranzano, arranging a meeting in the Bronx. They chose the strangest of places for neutrality, the lion's cage at the Bronx Zoo, a bizarre stage for a negotiation in the middle of a war. Luciano arrived with Joe Adonis, Tommy Lucchese, and Bugsy Siegel at his side, each man scanning the crowd as if every shadow hid a gunman. Maranzano was there, grave and theatrical, swearing in his pompous way that once Masseria was gone, there would be peace. He promised he would not interfere with Luciano, with Meyer Lansky, with Frank Costello, with Bugsy Siegel, or any of the others. He promised that they would be free to run their enterprises without interference. Lucky nodded, but in his mind, he had already marked Maranzano for death as surely as Masseria. So as the young guns plan their takeover, let's look at the new kids on the block before we head into their dealings in the shadows. They had very good reason to want the Mustache Pete's out of the way. The gunmen of Masseria had remained loyal. They exacted hits and they did as their egomaniacal overlord demanded, but they got no gain for all of their hard work. The old bosses worked like the old royal families of Europe, tax the living daylights out of your underlings, and expect them to remain compliant while they toiled and worked for nothing.
All while the Irish and the Jewish gangs were getting rich on the other side of the city, gangsters that the new generation of Italians had grown up with. In order to survive financially and because they had no qualms about working with people outside the Sicilian old school mafia, the young Italians had been in business with the Jews and the Irish since their teens. The bosses had a few inklings of these dealings but weren't aware of just how cozy the boys were with what they called the savages. The major players like Lucky Luciano and Costello weren't about to let the old dogs know just how friendly they were with the other gangs yet.
The three main figures were Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and Vito Genovese. Lucky and Genovese were just 33 years old in 1931, and Costello had just turned 40, practically still babies compared to the old feather dusters in charge. Let's start with Lucky, as he's undoubtedly the most influential player in this whole affair. He'd had his hand in just about every illegal swindle and scheme over the years, and he'd been mentored by Arnold Rothstein, the Jewish kingpin that put the organised into organised crime. Rothstein saw bootlegging, gambling, speakeasies, narcotics, and all of the rest as a business opportunity. The brain tackled the underworld with a business mindset, pure and simple. His logic was shared by the other Jewish gangs, and Lucky learnt a lot from watching Rothstein. Rothstein saw the biggest opportunity Prohibition, not as a way to cement factions or to bankroll comfortable lives for the greedy bosses at the top of the food chain, simply because tradition kept them there. He was by far the biggest importer of liquor out of everyone in that business during Prohibition, and his influence rubbed down on Lucky. Rothstein taught Lucky how to run his empire as a business, how to accept anyone of any race, and that's why the young guns in his crew, the men who he'd grown up with, men like Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel and Frank Costello, albeit not Sicilian, were right by his side. And that was something that Masseria and Maranzano couldn't accept. Joe the Boss had already insulted Lucky's good friend Frank Costello in the first few months of working together. He ridiculed Costello as an outsider, calling him the Calabrian, a district in Italy outside of Sicily, where all the old mustache Petes hailed from. Therefore, they refused to treat him as an equal, suggesting that his blood wasn't pure. Not being Sicilian was one part of Masseria's dislike for Costello. The other was because Costello married a Jewish girl, Loretta Geigerman. Regardless of how much Costello had put himself on the line for these mustache Petes, to them he was always just that, Calabrian. But anyone who knew Costello knew that he had the charm and political connections which could be beneficial to any outfit, and his payroll was quite literally a corrupt web of politicians, police officers, coast guards, and even mayors. Vito Genovese, on the other hand, was unpredictable in many ways. He was brave, he played the game fiercely, and he wanted the old dogs out as much as the rest did, and for the same reasons. But Genovese was always more of an opportunist than a brainiac, but a useful opportunist under the circumstances, nevertheless. More than everything else, Vito was a relentless and remorseless killer, and it was those qualities that Lucky was about to put to use. The plan for Masseria's elimination was drawn with meticulous care. On April the 15th, 1931, Lucky lured Joe the Boss into a sense of comfort. They met at their usual suite at the Philadelphia Hotel, pouring wine into crystal glasses, Luciano flattering, laughing, and painting pictures of the victories to come. He told Masseria that he'd drawn up a plan to strike Maranzano's lieutenants all across the city, and that soon Maranzano would be finished, and they would rule unchallenged. Masseria laughed with delight, clapped him on the back, and poured more wine, blind to the noose that was tightening around his neck. Around noon, Lucky suggested a drive to Coney Island, with the weather being fine, the spring air bright and clean. He said, "Let's celebrate, Joe," and Masseria agreed. They drove in a black limousine down to the Nuovo Via Tomorrow, a restaurant on Coney Island where Luciano had already arranged everything. They dined for hours, drinking bottle after bottle, Lucky smiling, toasting, and dealing cards for a game of Clon, the simple two-handed Sicilian game that Masseria loved. The restaurant emptied over the next few hours until they were the only patrons left, Lucky shuffling the deck while Joe the Boss leaned back in his chair, smug and heavy. Just after 3:30, Luciano excused himself, rising to go to the bathroom. As he entered the gents, the restaurant door swung open. Outside, a second car had pulled up, driven by Ciro Terranova, another Luciano ally. Inside sat the familiar faces of Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, Albert Anastasia, and Bugsy Siegel, pistols ready. They stormed through the door, guns raised. The thunder of shots filled the restaurant, the echoes crashing off the walls. Joe the Boss barely had time to register the betrayal before 6 bullets punched into him, ripping through flesh and bone. He was dead before he hit the floor, the ace of spades still clutched in his hand, a sight that would become one of the most famous underworld images ever captured when a photographer positioned the card deliberately upright, and it was posted on the front page of all the major New York papers the very next morning. When Luciano returned from the bathroom, Joe the Boss lay dead, and although the war was not over, the first king had fallen. News of Masseria's assassination spread through the city like a shockwave. The newspapers screamed of a gangland execution, the police swarmed Coney Island, and whispers swept from Harlem to Wall Street. For years, Masseria had loomed as the boss of all bosses, the man every Sicilian deferred to, and now he was gone, cut down by men he had thought loyal. Fear and uncertainty rippled across the underworld. Maranzano moved quickly, faster than anyone had expected. Within days, he summoned more than 500 mafiosi to a banquet hall on the Grand Concourse in the Bronx, where he stole Masseria's crown and declared himself the boss of all bosses. He spoke with the cadence of a Roman senator, quoting Caesar, insisting that every operation in the city now owed him tribute, that envelopes of $50,000 or more would be brought to him as signs of loyalty. He divided the city into families, pointing himself supreme, with every boss beneath him subordinate to his will. The 5 families Maranzano appointed were the Mangano family, led by Vincent Mangano, with Albert Anastasia as underboss, a man who openly idolized Luciano. Luciano himself headed his own family, backed by Vito Genovese. The Gagliano family was run by Tommy, with the other Tommy as his second in command. Both were amongst Luciano's closest friends. The Bonanno family was given to Joe Bonanno, who, over the years, had become personally close to Luciano and shared more with him than his fellow Castellammarese Maranzano. And finally, the Profaci family, headed by Joe Profaci, was already riddled with Luciano loyalists.
But in his arrogance, Maranzano overplayed his hand. The young men who had bled and fought to reach this point, Luciano, Lansky, Siegel, Costello, Anastasia, Gagliano, Lucchese, Capone, well, they hadn't risked everything to hand their fortunes to a self-styled emperor, one who quoted Latin at them. They had fought to build a new order, and Maranzano's posturing only confirmed that he was an obstacle, not a leader. Lucky and the new guard read the room instantly. The Mangano brothers, Vincent and Philip, with Albert Anastasia as underboss, were already in his corner. The Gagliano family, Bonanno, Profaci, even allies outside New York who were summoned, from Cleveland's Mo Dalitz and Frank Milano, from Detroit's Angelo Meli, who had taken over as consigliere after Milazzo's death, to Santo Trafficante in Florida and Salvatore Calderone in Pennsylvania. All of them leaned towards Luciano's vision. They wanted business, not feuds. They wanted profits, not Latin sermons. They wanted a syndicate, not an emperor.
The Castellammarese War had begun with Reina's death and Masseria's arrogance, but it would end with a single, decisive strike against the man who thought himself Caesar. For Lucky Luciano, the path was set. He had survived Maranzano's torture, he had betrayed Joe the boss, and now he would end the war on his own terms. What emerged from the ashes would not be the Mafia of Sicily, bound by blood and vendetta, but an American Mafia, one that was structured, modern, efficient, and under his control. The blood spilt in East Harlem and the Bronx, on Sheridan Avenue and Pelham Parkway, in Coney Island and Little Italy, had all been leading to this moment. The new guard knew that their next move had to be perfect. Removing Maranzano would be dangerous. He represented the last tether to the old world mafia. If he was struck down too suddenly, or without consultation, the other Sicilian bosses around the country might respond with fury, igniting a national vendetta. They had to be sure that when he acted, no one of importance would stand in his way. With Meyer Lansky at his side, Lucky Luciano organised a discreet 2-week tour across the United States. They travelled by train and by car, meeting quietly with bosses in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, and even sending word to Chicago. First, in western Pennsylvania, they met with Salvatore Calderone, a man disgusted with Maranzano's vanity. Calderone scoffed at the talk of Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great, dismissing it as delusion, and assured Luciano that no retaliation would come from him. In Cleveland, they met Mo Dalitz and Frankie Milano, leaders of the Ohio Mafia. They too thought Maranzano had gone mad. In Florida, Santo Trafficante lent his support, while from Chicago, Capone sent his emissaries, each of them acknowledging that the New York scene needed modern leadership, not antique tyranny. Everywhere Luciano went, he heard the same words. Maranzano was finished and the future was his to claim. But just as the final pieces were falling into place, Luciano slipped. He was arrested in Cleveland on minor charges, a stroke of bad luck that placed him briefly in custody. News of his presence in the Midwest leaked, and Maranzano's paranoia erupted. He deduced correctly that Lucky had been meeting with other bosses, and from that moment, he marked him for death. The summons came soon after. Lucky was ordered to the Helmsley building in Manhattan, where Maranzano kept his office. For hours, the old Sicilian grilled him, his voice rising, his temper flaring, his questions relentless. Why had he gone to Cleveland? Who had he spoken to? What plots were being woven behind his back? Lucky listened calmly, answered vaguely, and deflected without provoking. When he finally walked out of the building, he was outwardly composed, but he knew that the line had been crossed. He was no longer a subordinate under suspicion. Lucky Luciano was a marked man. He was right. Maranzano began compiling a death list, written in his own hand, with Luciano's name at the very top. Beneath it were Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, and Joe Adonis. Paranoia shredded Maranzano's discipline. The ancient code of Sicilian exclusivity, to never employ outsiders, never to trust anyone beyond one's own blood, was abandoned. In desperation, he reached out to Vincent Mad Dog Coll, the most volatile Irish killer in New York. Coll was already notorious for his aforementioned turf war with Dutch Schultz, who was one of Lucky's allies, but greed overcame any hesitation. For $25,000, Coll accepted the contract. Madness had a price. It was Tommy Lucchese who got wind of the plan. Lucchese's true loyalty had always been to Luciano. When Maranzano let slip that Coll would strike soon, Lucchese carried the news straight back to Lucky. The trap was set. Luciano and Genovese were to be summoned to the Helmsley building, where Coll would be waiting.
Lucky and Meyer Lansky moved immediately. They assembled a team of 4 Jewish hitmen from out of town, men with no connection to Maranzano's circle, and men whose faces would not be recognised. The crew was led by Red Levine, a cold professional whom Lansky and Luciano both trusted. For days, they were drilled in a safe house, practicing their roles, their movements, their lines. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. They would pose as federal agents, claim to be arresting Maranzano for tax evasion, and, in the confusion, disarm his guards before striking.
On September the 10th, 1931, the day came. Maranzano had indeed summoned Luciano and Genovese to his office, expecting to confront them with Coll at his side. But before any of that could happen, the 4 supposed agents walked through his doors. They carried themselves with authority, flashing badges, speaking with clipped precision, ordering the bodyguards against the wall. The guards, uncertain and unwilling to challenge federal officers, complied. Lucchese, present as an insider, pointed discreetly towards the back office where Maranzano waited. The hit itself was fast, brutal, and merciless. The men stormed the office, knives flashing, pistols raised. Maranzano had no time to react. He was stabbed, shot, and stabbed again, collapsing onto the floor, bleeding out beneath the mahogany desk where he had dreamed of empire. At 45 years old, Salvatore Maranzano, the last of the old Sicilian mustache Petes, was dead. Panic consumed the building. His guards bolted down the stairs rather than be caught near the body. On the way out, they passed Vincent Coll himself, arriving late, bewildered to see men streaming past him. He never even had the chance to fulfill his contract. Later, Tommy Lucchese explained everything to Luciano, as at this point he didn't know who was brazen enough to take the contract. Coll had been the instrument of Maranzano's paranoia, bought and paid for to kill them both. This revelation sealed Coll's fate. He had pocketed $25,000 of Maranzano's money. Luciano placed a contract on his head for the same sum. Dutch Schultz doubled it, and Oni Madden, an old Gopher Gang mentor to Coll, was pressured by Luciano to arrange the hit. 5 months later, Mad Dog Coll was gunned down in a telephone booth at the London Chemist drugstore on West 23rd Street in Hell's Kitchen. His body riddled with bullets as he screamed into the receiver. The era of wild dogs had no place in Lucky Luciano's new world. But the death of Maranzano wasn't the only hit that the Young Guns needed to carry out on September the 10th. They were only just getting started.
This night is referred to as the Night of the Sicilian Vespers, after a historical event that occurred on March the 30th, 1282, in Palermo, Sicily. It was a bloody uprising by the Sicilian people against the oppressive rule of a king. And it's a fitting name for this night nearly 700 years later, in 1931. The king had fallen, Maranzano was dead. The Young Guns had made sure that taking Maranzano out wouldn't warrant retaliation from most in the underworld, but there were a few that they couldn't trust, and so a purge of Maranzano's closest allies began. Just 2 hours after Maranzano was taken out, at around 5:40 p.m, Lucky sent one of his Jewish killers, probably Bugsy Siegel, to the Bronx, because outside a barber shop at 2400 Arthur Avenue stood one of Maranzano's closest allies, Jimmy Marino, of whom no photos exist. Marino was stood with his 2 daughters, aged 6 and 4, when a gunman approached him and fired a revolver 6 times into his head. Marino was dead before he hit the floor. An hour after Marino was gunned down, 2 Maranzano allies from what is now called the D. Cavalcante family in New Jersey, Sam Monaco and Louis Russo, disappeared. No photos of either men have survived, but their bodies were found in Newark Bay a few days later. They'd been tortured and then shot to death, presumably because they promised to retaliate after Maranzano's death. Around the same time that Monaco and Russo were found dead, the body of Gerardo Scopato was found strangled and trussed in a sack in the back of a car at the front of 216 Windsor Place in Brooklyn. Scopato was the owner of the Nuovo Via Tamaro and the man who conveniently went on a walk down the beach as Masseria was killed. Scopato was murdered as he was the only person who could prove the Young Guns were behind the murder of Masseria. Then, 3 days later, on September the 13th, 1931, the New Guard took their biggest scalp. Joe Siragusa, the boss of the Pittsburgh crime family and a close Maranzano ally who had promised retaliation for the murder. The aforementioned Salvatore Calderone was the retired boss of the Pittsburgh crime family and the unofficial boss of the whole of Pennsylvania, and he had given Lucky the green light to whack Maranzano, but Siragusa had told Calderone that he was sending gunmen to New York to hunt Lucky for whacking his friend Maranzano, and that sealed his fate. Siragusa was shot 6 times in the face, hand, chest and arm, and died at the bottom of these basement steps in his mansion at 2523 Beechwood Boulevard in Squirrel Hill. And the potential retaliation from Siragusa had been silenced. And with that, the Castellammarese War, the war that had taken over 120 lives in 19 months, was over. And the future, well, that now belonged to the New Guard. The death of Salvatore Maranzano was not so much the end of a man as it was the death of a system, the closing chapter in a way of doing business that had reigned in New York City since the first Sicilians had stepped off the boats at Ellis Island with knives tucked in their belts and vendettas carried like heirlooms. The old order went into the ground with him, and the city that had been quite literally soaked in blood for 2 years seemed, for a moment, to breathe easier.
Maranzano had crowned himself Carpi dei Carpi, and within weeks, he had been cut down, just as Joe the Boss before him had been. The crown itself was Lucky's to take, but the crown was cursed, poisoned, a beacon that made its wearer the most obvious target in the underworld. Luciano would not make the same mistake. He would not step into the role that had brought only death to those who wore it. He would not reign as king, only to fall as a martyr. He would do something far more dangerous, far more lasting. He would dissolve the crown altogether. His new vision began to take shape almost immediately after Maranzano's death. The underworld needed a new order, not another boss of bosses, and so, in the autumn of 1931, Luciano gathered his closest allies and began planning what would become the single greatest innovation in the history of American organized crime. He knew that if it was to succeed, it would need more than a New York consensus. It would need to be national. It would need to stretch from Buffalo to Chicago, from Detroit to Philadelphia, even down to Florida and across to Cleveland. It would need the assent of the men who had fought in the war, sacrificed their soldiers, and shed their blood. It would need to be built not in the shadows, but in the clear light of an open Congress. Fittingly then, the venue chosen to birth the greatest innovation in the history of American organized crime was the Congress Hotel in Chicago, an immense pile of stone and glass on Michigan Avenue that looked out across Lake Michigan with the kind of grandeur that appealed to Al Capone. Capone himself arranged the logistics with the same thoroughness he might have brought to an army maneuver. Every suite in the hotel was booked. The corridors were lined with his soldiers, men with pistols beneath their coats and Tommy guns tucked into violin cases, standing at attention as though guarding a head of state. Lookouts were posted on the pavements outside. Even the kitchen staff were hand-picked and paid off. For those few days in the autumn of 1931, the Congress Hotel was not merely a hotel. It was transformed into a fortress, a neutral ground that was made impenetrable by Capone's presence. Into this fortified space came the great figures of the American underworld. From Buffalo, Stefano Margadino, the quiet Maranzano ally who controlled the Canadian border and the flow of whiskey from Ontario. From Cleveland, the familiar faces of Mo Dalitz and Frank Milano, Jewish and Italian allies whose rackets had knitted Ohio into the syndicate's fabric. From Detroit, the Purple Gang and the Partnership sent emissaries, their reputation for violence as sharp as ever. Philadelphia dispatched men with links to Mickey Duffy and the Lanzetti brothers, hardened killers with eyes for opportunity. Florida's Santo Trafficante was represented, as were men from Kansas City and New Orleans, smaller families who understood that their future would be decided here. Every underling of Joe the Boss and Maranzano was also present, as was every single man who fought and survived in the Castellammarese War. Luciano spoke of Masseria and Maranzano, of how both had tried to dominate by fear, and of how both had been destroyed. He spoke of the cycle of vendetta that had plagued the Mafia for generations, of the waste of men and money, of the constant instability. Then he offered his vision. There would be no more boss of bosses. The title itself was abolished. Instead, each family, each city, each region would control its own territory and affairs. No man would interfere in another's house, but above them all there would be a council, a commission, a national board of directors for organized crime. Every boss would sit on it. every vote would be equal. No decision of consequence could be taken without unanimous agreement. In this way, disputes could be settled not with pistols and shotguns, but with discussion, with negotiation, with arbitration. The room was quiet when he finished, the kind of silence that falls from recognition. These men, hardened and suspicious, knew instinctively that they were witnessing the birth of something new, something that might finally end the endless wars and give them the profits they craved without the constant funerals. One by one, they nodded. Capone himself, sitting like a baron at the head of the table, gave his assent. Margadino agreed. Dalitz, Milano, the men from Detroit, Philadelphia, and New York all in turn signalled their approval. The syndicate had been born not as a single empire under a tyrant, but as a federation, as a commission.
The structure was simple in outline but profound in its implications. New York, the centre of gravity for the Italian underworld, would be divided into 5 permanent families. Each would have its own boss, underboss, consigliere, and capo regimes commanding their own soldiers. This was not Maranzano's old plan of dictating from above, handing out commands as if he was sitting at Julius Caesar's throne. This was a balance of equals. It was a structure that allowed for autonomy while persevering unity. The families could manage their own affairs, control their own rackets, make their own money. But the difference was that when conflict arose between them or when questions of national importance loomed, the commission would govern.
The 5 families chosen in New York reflected both history and politics. Vincent Mangano would head the Brooklyn family with his underboss, Albert Anastasia. The Bronx and East Harlem would go to Tommy Gagliano, with Tommy Lucchese as his right hand. Joe Profaci, an old Maranzano underling, was given his own family, his loyalty now with Lucky and the commission. Joseph Bonanno, young, intelligent and cautious, assumed leadership of the old Castellammarese faction itself, inheriting the remnants of Maranzano's empire. And finally, there was Luciano's own family. After inheriting Masseria's empire, they were by far the most powerful, enriched by its alliances with Jews like Lansky and Siegel, and by the presence of Vito Genovese as underboss, Frank Costello as consigliere, and Joe Adonis as capo regime. Even Jewish syndicates in New York, though technically outside the Mafia's ethnic boundaries, were represented through the New Guard. Men like Lansky and the garment racketeer Lepke Buchholter, Longy Zwilman and Mo Dalitz, Dutch Schultz and Bugsy Siegel, they were all Jewish and had no formal rank in the Mafia, but they sat at the table nonetheless, recognised for the indispensable role they played in the rackets and ending the Castellammarese War. It was the first time in the history of American organised crime that Jews, Italians and others cooperated under a single umbrella, bound not by blood but by business. The commission met only rarely in full session, but its presence was felt everywhere. Disputes that might have once led to bloodshed were now settled by arbitration. If 2 families argued over territory, their bosses appeared before the commission. If a succession crisis threatened to spark violence, the commission brokered a solution. If an ambitious soldier plotted against his capo, the matter could be raised to the commission before it exploded into open war. In this way, Lucky's creation acted as a brake on the endless cycle of vendetta that had defined the Mafia for decades. It did not end violence altogether, that would have been impossible, but it channeled it, controlled it, made it purposeful rather than chaotic.
The 5 families remained, each with its own boss and territory, but above them all stood the commission, the safeguard which was designed to settle disputes before they could spiral into another bloodbath. Out of the chaos which was the Castellammarese War, the American Mafia as we know it today was born. It was the great Mafia Civil War, a conflict that buried the old Mustache Pete's and ushered in a new order. For the next century, organised crime in America would operate under this structure, disciplined, coordinated and bound by rules forged in blood. And for that enduring legacy, the underworld would always trace its roots back to the Castellammarese War. Thanks so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. If you liked the video, then please consider becoming a channel subscriber or give the video a thumbs up at least. And if you want to join the discussion in my Discord, you can. It's an app where we discuss these characters and stories I cover in more detail, and to be honest, just about everything else. I'll leave an invite link in a pinned comment if you want to join, and I'll see you in the next one.